This essay is about the problematic relation between power and responsibility. The relationship of history to power is a latent problem that is only briefly touched upon, but it is claimed that power has no history, and this pitches us immediately into the Kantian domain of philosophical psychology, in which it is maintained that the human will causes itself to act. This is its primary power. But this is not the end of the story, because the will on Kantian theory is subject to, firstly, the categories of the understanding, and in this respect is self-causing. Secondly, the will is also related to reason and its freedom to choose. Furthermore, in his groundwork, Kant claims that this will is universally and necessarily good insofar as its acts are determined by the categorical imperative, which explains not just what we as a matter of fact do, but also what we ought to do, what we must do, given certain ethical circumstances. We have, Kant argues, general duties and responsibilities to treat people as ends in themselves, and also particular duties such as promises ought to be kept, and value the truth. These two last ethical maxims are also political maxims in Kantian political philosophy, which widens its scope of concern to generate universal human rights from the duties generated in the political arena. The government, Kant claims, has a duty to keep its promises and value the truth in the court of public opinion, but it also has economic duties to distribute benefits and burdens equally and ensure that the law protects land, possessions, and work. A paradox can easily be set up by turning Kant upside down, as Hegel claimed to do in relation to the critical project. One can, for example, deny the truth of Kant's idea of the good will insofar as government activity is concerned, and agree with Machiavelli that the way in which the prince ought to rule is via the manipulation and deception of his subjects. Ricoeur has several times in previous essays suggested that there is inherent evil in the exercise of power by authorities, so the choice to invoke Machiavelli in this discussion about the nature of power comes as no surprise. In this essay, Ricoeur compares capitalist and socialist forms of government in terms of an ideal democratic organization that rules in the name of historical rationality, which cannot, it is argued, be reduced to any form of economic argumentation. The paradox at issue for Ricoeur is that the greatest evil adheres to the greatest rationality, that there is political alienation because polity is relatively autonomous. Page 249. Ricoeur also quotes the opening of Aristotle's Politics. Page 249. Every state is a society of some kind, and every society, like all forms of association, is instituted with a view to some good, for mankind always acts for an end which is esteemed good. Book 1, 1-3 Trans Jowett B, Aristotle is one of the first systematic critical rationalists and would find the view that rationality is the greatest evil, paradoxical. For Aristotle, man's rationality is an essential potentiality he possesses, a potentiality which actualizes under certain complex conditions. Man aims at the good, and he aims to know, and rationality is involved in both of these ends. He is, according to Aristotle's essence-specifying definition, a rational animal capable of discourse, and it is the form of being a language user that transforms his form of animality, sush. This is part of the self-actualization process that uses the material of being a language user in the knowledge acquisition process and in the practical process of becoming a political being. If man did not, for example, live in a polis and engage himself in the process of surviving in a state of nature, he would, on Aristotle's view, revert to a primitive existential state in which neither knowledge nor ethics/politics would be important in such a life. The goods aimed at in such a state would be those of the beast. Kant would also question Ricoeur's proposed identification of rationality with evil. On the Kantian account, authorities that are tyrannical are perversions of the good will. The unconditioned condition presupposed in Kantian ethics, such authorities are pathological phenomena which are the consequence of the perversion of the idea of the good in itself. The autonomy of what Ricoeur calls the polity consists, for Kant, in a concern for serving the community, a concern grounded in the requirement of the categorical imperative that one act in such a manner as to treat people as ends in themselves. This is a form of action which requires the formation of maxims possessing the characteristics of universality and necessity. In other words, if we are evaluating the phenomenon of tyranny, we are dealing with a pathological consequence of the perversion of the good in itself. Classical scholars will recall in the context of such discussions Glaucon's demand aimed at Socrates, in the early sections of the Republic, that any definition of justice must meet the requirements of both being good in its consequences and good in itself. Ricoeur also refers to Rousseau in his attempt to further articulate the concept of polity. The social contract, it is argued, is presupposed in the relation between political authority and those affected. The social contract is a virtual pact that occurs principally at the founding moments of nations, moments which inevitably include elements of violence. With this idea, the focus is turned away from the duties and responsibilities of authority, and toward the consent of those affected. In this context, the relation is viewed in the light of the consequences of historical events. The question that is then posed is, do the citizens of a nation accept that conditions of the contract have been fulfilled by their government? Much, of course, depends upon the nature of the conditions of the contract. Are they, for example, fundamentally ethical, or are they merely economic conditions favoring one class over another or one group of people over another, believers over non-believers? In other words, is there alienation of large groups or minorities as a consequence of the policies and laws proposed and enacted by the government in question? Ricoeur claims paradoxically in the context of this discussion that Rousseau is Aristotle, page 254. The argument for this strange identification of thinkers from very different schools of thought, classical v romantic, is that, in Ricoeur's opinion, Rousseau's terms pact and general will are in essence identical with Aristotle's hylomorphic terms nature and end, telos. This identification depends on detaching teleological explanation/justification from material, efficient and formal explanations/justifications, which, on Aristotle's account, ought not to occur if one is intent upon systematic explanations/justifications that meet the rational criteria of knowledge in general and political knowledge in particular. Rousseau's appeal, for example, to amor propre was a denial of the importance of rationality in true Romantic tradition and an attempted celebration of the idea of man as a compassionate animal corrupted by his society. Man is born innocent and free, but enslaved by evil societies. For Rousseau, it was Robinson Crusoe that best manifested man's original and innocent relation to nature and himself. Aristotle, as a matter of fact, was disliked by Rousseau, and Aristotle in his turn would have seen in Robinson Crusoe a being enslaved by nature, a being waiting to be freed by the forces of civilization. For Rousseau, man is dominated by a sentiment which he calls amour propre, from which flows, firstly, a tendency to favor himself over others, and secondly, latent ideas of inequality which allow destructive activities performed under the banner of honor. Government, in the view of Rousseau, ought to be based on the general will of the people, which the rulers have a duty to take into consideration in their governing activities. Unfortunately, the model or pattern for this form of rule is, Rousseau claims, to be found in Rome or Sparta. In such societies we encounter a military spirit and code of honor, which historically have had problematic relations to the ideas of justice and freedom. Rousseau, we ought to recall, is a product of the ancien regime, a regime that did not sense the growing frustration of its citizens, did not, that is, concern itself with the general will. Aristotle's view of the Spartan society was far less favorable than that of his pupil Plato. Spartans were rumored to have hated philosophy, and we know they admired and respected honor-loving heroes like Achilles and Hector. The suggestion by the Athenians that the times they were a-changing and that Socrates and his love of philosophy was the new ideal for heroism would have been ridiculed in Sparta. The crucifixion of Jesus, compare this event with the death of Socrates, was, of course, an act of civil authorities, and there are arguments to be made in both of these cases that power was being exercised outside the good intentions of the law, i.e. irrationally. These were not the violent acts of founding a new order, but rather acts designed to protect civic and religious authorities from powerful criticism. Ricoeur refers to Marx, and the claim that the state is an instrument of class violence in the name of the controlling forces is put in relation to Stalin's rule, which represented the dictatorship of the proletariat. History has testified to the destructive forces that were released during this period of Soviet history. Stalin rejected the order of truth and the order of the law in the process of the militarization of the minds of the Soviet people. Ricoeur claims that liberalism was born in the 18th century. The philosophers of the 18th century devised the term liberalism, which no doubt goes beyond the destiny of the bourgeoisies. In its profound intention, liberal politics comprised an element of universality, for it was adjusted to the universal problematic of the state, beyond the form of the bourgeois state. p.267. There is no place for any form of the militarization of minds in the Enlightenment liberalism we encounter in the political philosophy of Kant. On the contrary, war is the enemy of civilization in general and education in particular, in Kantian thought. For Kant, man both understands from a purely rational point of view that war is an evil, but as if this was not sufficient, he has also experienced firsthand the horrors and devastations of wars. For Kant, therefore, any declaration of war must be an abuse of power which ignores the knowledge we all have in relation to an activity that always has unintended consequences, and even when it achieves its military aims only does so at huge cost. Ricoeur claims that Stalinism was overthrown by justice and truth, and presumably he means that these ideas were valued by the opponents of Stalin. Opponents which included intellectuals, writers and artists. The end result of the successful removal of Stalin was not, as we know, the creation of a liberal democracy manifesting its general will in the creation of political parties, free elections and a professionally run parliamentary system uncorrupted by special interests. Ricoeur wonders whether the liberal democratic system is fundamentally liberal or whether it is a residue of bourgeois politics, merely a variation on an old corrupt and violent theme. Arendt in her work on totalitarianism noted the ease with which political parties were dissolved by mass popular movements in the 20th century, and the question remains whether once this has happened to a nation, whether political parties can ever re-emerge in a democratic form. Ricoeur points out that liberal political parties must be liberal, in a wider sense than bourgeois economic liberalism. They must, that is, reflect ongoing free discussions in a society. Ricoeur also acknowledges the importance of the Kantian idea of freedom which, he argues, is the central problem of politics.